Hello, and welcome to Music Stuff with Spock. Today I'd like to talk to you about a concept that I came up with about 15 to 20 years ago called punk avant garde. And this came about when I started learning how to play violin, viola, and cello. And I practiced for about 6 months, and then life got complicated and I couldn't practice as much. And over time I've picked it up and practiced for a few weeks, sometimes a month, and then I get busy with something else, working on a project, school, and then I realize, oh, I haven't picked up my violin in a month or two. And so I've never been able to pick up the facility to have a really good tone and just pick up the instrument and play in tune, which is my biggest problem. And I think really to get that skill, you need to practice every day for, on average, an hour for at least 3 or 4 years, so that over time you practice for about 1,500 hours of just sitting there every day listening and learning how to do that. And because I haven't learned how to do that, I can't play in tune. And that became frustrating. And so about 10 years ago or so, I came up with this idea of, I suppose the logic was, if I cannot play in tune and I want to be able to play something, then I have to come up with some kind of music where you don't have to play in tune. And so I was in the midst of studying microtonality, and I knew it would be some form of microtonality. But to write very specific pitches, that's even harder than just playing in tune. So I came up with the idea, well, it doesn't matter what or how you tune the piece. What's important is the performance, which is part of the fundamental part of early punk music. It was more, it was an attitude. You know, you tune your instruments all nice. We're not going to bother doing that. You know how to play your instruments? Well, we don't. And it didn't matter. And I saw a lot of early punk bands, late 70s, early 80s. So we were already into the punk era. And it was already starting to be morphed into other styles of music. And I started to see a distinction between rock bands who were playing in a punk manner and true punks. And most of the true punks, they played out of tune. And because of how they were playing, what they were playing, it didn't seem to matter. And so that's the attitude I wanted to use for this style of music. So I worked on several different incarnations of notation. Started off with lines and graphic notation, and eventually turned into different notes. And then I thought of everything revolving around a line. And then eventually that morphed into 3 lines showing off so that you could show the different strings on the stringed instruments. And I was specifically working towards putting together a set of pieces called Collective Improvisations for String Quartet. And so I started working on that piece, and I started using different forms of the notation. I did a lot of sketches and did some recordings, but the first full piece I finished was something called Epsilon Lyrae, which is a small star in a constellation of Lyra. And I don't like that recording. It was one of the very first recordings I ever did with GarageBand. Didn't realize my tracks had compression and distortion on it. So along the way, I put together a draft of that Collective Improvisations piece and recorded the whole piece, and it's not done very well. But one of the movements was okay, so that's the one I just recently put up on YouTube. And so I thought I'd put this up to show off the notation. So the notation shows the durations and the articulations. In a lot of cases you have the dynamics and everything else, but it doesn't tell you what notes to play. It does show you what strings to play in a general manner and when you should move to another register. You can use this notation in a very general way and just write out lines, or you can be very specific and say up a third, down a second. And after working with this notational system, I realized that it doesn't just have to be used for microtonal music, which is what I'm doing it for, because I can't play in tune. But if you can play in tune, you could turn it into a tonal piece and say, okay, well, we're just going to play in G Lydian and up and down and play the piece as that. Or you could do it as a total chromatic work. Or you can play it as a microtonal work. So one of the things I'm going to do is write a brief passage and play it in all 3 of those different formats, I suppose. An early form of this notational system used notes with durations on a single line, with little arrows pointing in the direction that the melody should go. At first it was just very loose, And then I started experimenting with specific intervals that the player should go up and down. This same passage becomes more of a chromatic work when played on a fixed pitch instrument, like a keyboard or a woodwind. Here's another early incarnation of the system. This system uses two lines that represent the top and the bottom lines of the staff, more or less. And then all the pictures are drawn with X's. Here's an example of it being played by a string quartet. Now here's that same passage played by a chamber ensemble of 6 violins, 2 violas, and 2 cellos. Notice that the chords become much more complicated, and in some cases, clusters. After writing a few different sketches, I started experimenting with different ways of using this notation. The next thing I did was just use a single line, and I started that with a piece called Vega, and I have several sketches, and I haven't finished that piece either. But it's for a larger string ensemble. And I demoed the piece a couple of different times, a couple of different ways. I really need to get some bases to finish that piece. But this score used a combination of graphics and X's and various kinds of notes. And the single line gives you a reference, and then it can be either interpreted as the general range of the instrument or the range just on a single string. There are instances where they're playing double stops, and obviously that would be done on 2 strings, but the rest of it can be interpreted a couple of different ways. The studies in collective improvisation started off as a single-line staff, and the rhythms were notated, but they didn't line up. It was very general, and the first draft was meant to be highly improvised, but as I played it a few times, I realized that I was playing actual rhythm, so it went through a couple of different drafts. So here's an early legend from my first draft. The notes revolve around a single line, and the notes can either be written on the line or in the spaces above and below. For a wind instrument, this would represent the different registers. On a stringed instrument, well, the same thing, I suppose. But specifically for the strings, if you wanted them to play just on the high string or just on the low string, you could use ledger lines for those notes. The notes themselves were very general, short, medium, long, quick flurries of notes, and if you wanted specific rhythms, I used notes with X's for note heads. In terms of the contour of the line, you could show the pitch going up, pitch going down, give them the choice of going up or down, or you could have them go up or down by a specific interval. Here's a little bit of the initial demo of the first draft. So here's an updated version of the legend, specifically for strings. It uses a 3-line staff which divides the music up into 4 spaces, each one corresponding to one of the different strings on one of the instruments of the violin family. If there's a note on a line, then it can be either played as the note above or the note below. Jumping from a note on a space to a line or from a line to a space can either mean crossing from one string to the next string, or jumping up to a higher or lower register. I also added the use of algebraic letters above certain notes whose pitches have to be remembered and recalled at a later time. In a more general sense, this is a form of free microtonality. Usually, microtonal music adheres to a particular type of system, either some sort of just intonation, the use of quarter tones, third tones, fifth tones, or other such intervals, or the music divides the octave up into more or less than 12 equal parts. In punk avant-garde, any pitch is possible. Now, the notation system itself does not make a piece punk avant-garde. It's the concept of being able to play out of tune. The notation system itself can easily be used to write chromatic works, and the notation system can also be used to write diatonic or modal improvisations. Here the passage is played using free microtonality. Here's part of that same passage as a chromatic work. And here's that same passage in the tonality of F major. So there's a brief explanation of my concept of punk avant-garde and a little look at a couple of the notational systems that I'm using to write that kind of music. And so I have two parting thoughts. One, I think initially when I thought this up, it was a student endeavor for people who weren't good enough to play in an ensemble. I guess they are, and one of the things you do is try to play in tune, but every time you play a wrong note or you play something out of tune, you're concentrating on that and not the other aspects of playing. So if you tell the student that it doesn't matter what note they play and you cannot possibly play anything out of tune, that allows them to concentrate on the other aspects. First of all, listening and interacting with the other player, working on their tone, their vibrato, their bowing. And so when you study music, either playing or writing, it's good to break apart the different elements of doing that and practice them separately. And this is just one more opportunity to do that. And a teacher can very easily write out the lines. The notation system, well, like I said, the notation system itself is not necessarily for punk avant-garde. It can be used for any kind of improvisation at all. And it's very easy to write. You can just write lines and people follow them up and down and they can learn to interact. My second thought is there are two different kinds of players. Those that learn in either the classical jazz manner, where they learn to read and write and learn the theory behind it and learn to play that way. And in those instances, they don't start to improvise until much later. And there are other people who pick up the instrument and learn to play on their own, in which case they have to build up their ears. They usually play two tunes or play with friends of theirs who are learning. And they start to improvise right away, and it's much later that they start to read and write and study theory, if they do that at all. And this kind of notation, not the idea of punk avant-garde or even using that idea, is kind of a halfway point. So you can have people who can't read and can read, and you have them follow these graphic scores. And for the player who can't read, it just tells them what string and up and down, and I do believe they could follow that. And for people who can read, well, now they have to learn a whole new notation system and throw everything they knew out the window and learn to improvise on these shapes. And so it kind of puts both types of players at the same disadvantage. I don't know if it's a valid compositional technique or not. A lot of what I do, parts of it are neat, and then other parts are not so neat. And most of that is because of my playing ability. So time will tell whether this turns into a neat thing. I hope somebody else tries this with some students and see if it actually helps or not. Let me know in the comments. And for everyone, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.